in elections. In 1846 and 47 and 48, it was a different story. The native Mexicans who had lived in places like California and New Mexico made up the broad segment of the population out in this Mexican cession that the United States received from the nation of Mexico. And they were all rabidly anti-slavery. Slavery had been outlawed under Mexican law. And the thought that slavery might be permitted where it had never existed before really alarmed those people. At the same time, though, their very presence, the presence of those native Mexicans in that territory, alarmed people in the American South, slaveholders. And the slaveholders in the South began to get very ugly about this in 1846 and 47 and 48. And they say, you know, should we allow conquered people to govern their conquerors? Should the native Mexicans out in that territory be allowed to determine the future of slavery in a land that they no longer control, that is under American sovereignty and control? So again, this question of who the people were comes up. And it's not a very easy question to answer. So I kept digging a little more. I got back to 1836 and 1837. There wasn't much of a territorial dispute at that time, but there was one brewing, mainly over Texas, whether Texas would become a part of the United States or not. And in 1836 and in 1837, Texas was its own republic, the Lone Star Republic. These two men, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina and Henry Clay of Kentucky, are debating at that time over the future of slavery. And they're also debating the role, more particularly, of who really has the right to speak for the South and on the slavery issue. Because by 1836 and 1837, there has been the rise of an abolitionist movement in the North. People who are wholeheartedly committed to ending slavery within the United States. And that alarms men like John C. Calhoun, who begins to say, wait a minute. The Constitution guarantees slaveholders the right to hold slaves. And he goes so far as to say it guarantees the right of a slaveholder to not only hold his slave, but to take that slave wherever he wants to. That's his business. And if that means he wants to take that slave out into a territory, into a part of the United States that's not an actual state yet, then so be it. And the federal government has the obligation to make sure that that man's property in another human being, but property nonetheless, is honored, that his right to that is honored. Most Americans don't go along with that at this point. A number of them would come 1860 and 1861, and that, of course, would become very clear with the coming of the Civil War. But this man here, Henry Clay, he comes up with this compromise. He says, you know, again, we're talking about something that's going to happen in the future. We're talking about territories way out west. There's not a lot of people out there. You know, we're talking even about land that the United States doesn't control yet. Who knows if Texas is going to become a part of the United States or not? We don't know. So he says, let's not worry about this in Congress. Let's let the people out in the territories, whenever they get there and whoever they are, decide. You go back to the Missouri Compromise in the 1820s. And during the Missouri Compromise, when the North and the South were at loggerheads over the future of slavery in Missouri, our neighbor to the east, a Southern congressman comes up with an idea. Let's let the people of Missouri decide. You see the pattern here. It keeps developing. This happens again with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And you go back, what I found, to get to the point, is that people were talking about this very idea almost from the beginning of the nation's founding. And in this map here, I'll show you that this area up here, the area labeled Ohio and then into Indiana Territory, that was all part of a vast territory that at one time had been called the Northwest Territory. And in 1787, even before the ink had dried on the new Constitution that was ratified in September of that year, or that was written in September of that year, the Congress said, they created this vast territory up here, the Northwest Territory, and they said slavery will never exist within the bounds of this territory. The interesting thing, though, is that 3 years later in 1790, a territory was created down here, encompassing most of Tennessee and up into a little bit into Kentucky. And there was another ordinance passed in 1790 called the Southwest Ordinance. And it said that Congress would not decide, would not prohibit slavery, that the people within this territory themselves would decide whether they would permit or prohibit slavery. So what I found was that this idea of letting the people decide had existed from the earliest days of the Republic and had just continued to come down in different forms and in different meanings throughout the 80-year period between 1787 and then the coming of the Civil War in 1861. So then I asked, well, what did it all mean? This is all very interesting, presumably. I may be putting everybody to sleep, but presumably this was interesting to me, and I'm thinking about, well, what does it mean, really? You know, this idea of letting the people decide and when they should decide it. And why is all of this important? Well, the first thing I found was this fact that the disputes over the definition of popular sovereignty had existed from the earliest days of the Republic on up to 1861. And I found that even in the 1790s, and it continued and increased going forward from there, the North and the South differed dramatically over how they believed popular sovereignty would operate. Southerners insisted that popular sovereignty meant this, that a territory could come into the Union, that it would be created. Let's say Mississippi Territory, which was created in 1798. That Mississippi Territory could be created by Congress. The people would slowly move into this territory. Eventually there would be enough people there for it to become a state. And so when a territory is ready to become a state, several things happen. A convention is declared, and delegates to a convention are elected. And at this convention, the people themselves, these delegates who have been elected by all of the residents of the territory, draft a constitution. And that, for Southerners, is a really special moment. That is the first moment where a state, or a territory that's about to become a state, is imbued with sovereignty. And popular sovereignty itself, you know, it's sort of one of the bulwarks of the American system of government, that the people govern themselves. And according to the Southerners, they say that when you create this constitutional convention and you're poised to become a state, that's that special moment. The spark kind of goes off, if you will, and you become imbued with this power to determine your own customs and your own affairs. And that's a very significant moment. The Southerners go along with this idea, and they become more and more strident in this idea, in no small part because they believe in the idea of states' rights. And the idea of states' rights is simply this, that any state within the Union, Virginia, North Carolina, any of it, is a sovereign